Okay, today's stuff we're going to be learning is Yoma Kaf Daled. I'll be away next week. I'm just making an announcement about it. So Sunday to Friday, there won't be a Zoom class, but all the other class, everything will be up on the site. It'll actually be up a little earlier than usual. It'll be up, already first thing in the morning, Israel time. So if you want to come on Zoom, just don't come on next week, but come on after that, before that, anytime. We'll be back on Erev Shavuot learning as usual. Okay, we saw yesterday's daf, and I brought this on the sheet to refresh your memory. We had a machloket Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer about when it said that the Kohen switches his clothes between Haramat Hadeshin to Trumat Hadeshin, right? From Haramat Hadeshin to Hotza'at Hadeshin. Remember, there's two actions. One is taking a little bit of the ashes off the altar, and then there's taking it out of the room entirely, right? When the pile gets big, or some people say they did every day. Some people said it's only when the pile gets really big. Let's look at Rashi Rambam about it. But which clothes, right? Whether really the whole question is Haramat Hadeshen, right? You wear different clothes in Hotza'at Hadeshen. Does that mean different clothes, not Bigdei Kehuna, not the Kohen's clothing, because it's not an avodah really? It's not one of them, an activity that needs clothes, or, right, and is that, or really you have to wear the clothes, okay? Then, Rishlach, in other words, and then it's actually teaching you something else. It's just that they're worn out clothing. They wear worn out clothing. So then, Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan have a machloket. Is there machloket only in carrying out, or is it also in the harama? Even that activity, that symbolic activity of taking a little bit of the ashes and putting them on the floor next to the altar, some people think that in and of itself, right, Rish Lakish says, that's also not an activity, again, that there's a machloket about whether it's an activity or not. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says, no, harama, everybody agrees it's an activity, and as I say activity, it's an avoda, it's one of the rituals. And of course you have to do it with the Bigdei Kehuna. Then we saw, where does the machloket stem from? This issue that when it talks about the Haramat Hadeshen, picking up that little bit of ashes and putting it on the floor, is, right in that spot next to the altar, it says there the Kohen wears 2 of the 4 garments. Do we take that literally, that it's only 2? Or does it mean all 4, it just only mentioned 2 of them? And that's the big debate between them, how to understand, right? And then we said, why don't we suggest that maybe this machloket that Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are having, okay, Rabbi Yochanan thinks that he wore all 4 clothes. It only says 2, but it really means all 4. And if you remember, we saw that from the words Yilbash, right? Actually, we're going to see that now. So then they say, maybe their machloket is machloket Tanaim. We have Rabbi Yehuda who says the word Yilbash is extra, because if you remember, the pasuk says, V'lavasha kohen midobad. He wears the ketonet, the cloak, and then Michnasei bad Yilbash al basaro, it says the root to wear twice in that verse. What's the second time coming to say? Not only these 2, but he actually wore all 4. Now, if you have to wear all 4 clothing, it's what we call an avodah. It's an actual temple ritual. Rabbi Dosa said, no, we don't darshan it to teach you that. We learned something else from there. What does he learn? What is Yilbash? It means that the Kohen, there's something besides his clothes that he can wear. And what is that? Well, he can actually wear the clothes that a Kohen, it's to teach us some other halacha entirely, that a Kohen can wear the clothes that a Kohen Gadol wore in Yom Kippurim, the ones that were the Bigdei Lavan, the white clothes, not the golden clothes, right? But when he wears the ones that are not the usual Kohen clothes to do the not Kohen Gadol normal clothing on Yom Kippur to do the Avodot Yom Kippurim, those clothes can be used by regular Kohen Hedjot during the year. That's what the extra Yilbash comes to teach, which means it doesn't come to teach about the 4, that he wears 4 articles of clothing, which means he must think he only wears 2. So why don't we say that he holds like Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Yochanan? And then we say, not that he holds, right? It would be the reverse. The Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rabbi Yehuda, because these are Tanaim that had the debate before them. And Rish Lakish holds like Rabbi Dosa. Now, we were in the middle of this Breita and kind of stopped in the middle, but the Breita brought 2 questions of Rebbe against Rabbi Dosa. Rebbe said, how could you possibly say that the Kohen Gadol's clothes on Yom Kippur could be worn by a Kohen Hedger during the year? Number one, we said, right, it's not the same clothes. Remember, the belt was different. Again, there's debate about it, but he claims, I hold of the opinion that they didn't have the same belt. Number two, you can't bring something down in sanctity. Malim bekodesh ve'emo redeem. This was used on Yom Kippur. You can't use it all day long, all year long, and you can't take something that was a Kohen Gadol's and use it for a regular Kohen. Can't be. So what did he say, right? What is Yilbash to say? Oh, it's to include that he can wear worn out clothing. Now we're bringing another bright on this topic, and only after that are we going to get back to, is this a machloket tanaim? Is it the same debate that they're having here that Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish had? So here's another drasha that has to do with the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur and what happens to his clothes after. It says when he finishes his work that day, at the end of the chapter, in Achrei Mode, it says, V'nicham sham, he puts them down. So what does it mean he puts them down? Puts them down where? So one drasha is melamed tu'unim gniza. This shows that they need to be put away, buried, right? We know what a gniza is, right? It's where you put Sifrei Kodesh, right? Sidurim that are falling apart and things like that with God's name in it. These also have to be put aside. No one can ever use them. Okay, it's not clear where they actually have to be buried, but the point is no one can use them ever again. That's why it says, and he places them there, right? Why else would they bother telling us what he does with his clothes? Must be places them there, they can't ever be used. Rabbi Dosa omer re'uyin hem lekohen hedyot. Right? No, you don't have to put them away. A kohen hedyot can wear them. So how does he explain? And he puts them there. They're just no longer usable for next Yom Kippur. You can't, a Kohen Gadol has to, maybe the idea is he has to have new clothes. He can't wear clothes that were already used for Yom Kippur, but they can be used for Kohen Hedger. Okay, so that's another part of the machloket between the two of them, about this idea about the Kohen Gadol's clothes. But now back to our topic. My lav, bahaka miflagei. Is it not that this is the root of their machloket? This is what we said already. Demar savar avodahi. The one who darshans, Yilbash, comes to include all four clothing. It's because he holds it's a ritual. Umar, like Rabbi Yochanan. Umar savar lav avodahi. And Rabbi Dosa, who doesn't use the drasha for that, and uses it for something else entirely, must hold it's because he doesn't view it as avoda, and therefore they don't wear four clothes because he doesn't darshan it to say they wear all four garments. And therefore, why don't we say that it's the same machloket? We usually know when it's this kind of structure, the Gemara is going to reject it, right? It started off with the words nema ketanai, let us suggest, and my lav is it not, which usually ends with no, it's not. Okay, you're wrong. So now they say, lo dekule alma avodahi. Everybody thinks it's avodah. Even Rabbi Dosa thinks it's a ritual, and that you wear the four garments. The whole root of their machloket is the following. Mar savar tzricha kra leribuye, umar savar lo tzricha kra leribuye. If you notice, this isn't your typical machloket, where one says you need four clothes and the other says you don't need four clothes, right? They weren't arguing on parallel tracks. They were just, what was parallel about them? They were each taking the same verse, but learning something else from it. It's not that Rabbi Dosa said, no, you only have to wear two garments. So what they're going to say is that one said you need a pasuk to prove it. Without the pasuk, that's Rabbi Yehuda. Says if you didn't have the pasuk, the word yilbash, it says clearly two, it must have meant only two and you don't need four. And according to Rabbi Dosa, no, it's obvious you wear all four. Why? I'm guessing he thinks it's obvious because if it says you're supposed to wear two of the garments, obviously you're supposed to wear all the garments. It just didn't mention them. It starts to tell you he wears the Kohen's clothing. He says the pants and the ketonet, the cloak. But the tunic is a better translation. He wears those two. Obviously, he wears all four. You don't need a pasuk, a word, gilbash, to teach you that he wears all four. You would think about it. If he didn't need to wear the clothes, then he wouldn't need to wear the pants and the tunic either. So therefore, you don't need a verse to teach you that. And therefore, the verse is free to learn something else. But both think it's a ritual. Both think that you have to do. Okay. I'm going to glance at the chart. Right. So we're going to talk about. Someone asked, is there anything else you don't need the four garments for? We're going to have a discussion at the end of today's stuff about whether when you do the pious, now the pious isn't exactly an avodah, but it makes sense. When you do the lottery, you don't necessarily need to wear the four garments, although there's a debate about it. By the way, about the pious, a lot of people tried to help me out with remembering what game I was talking about. Some people suggested rocks, paper, scissors. No, but now I remember what game it was. It came to me this morning. It was called The 21st Finger Is It? And I looked it up on Wikipedia to check, or on Google. Google has a description of it where everyone puts out their fingers and whoever's is the 21st, it's really exactly the same. That the 21st finger is it, according to what I read, although I don't remember doing this, but you can really put out any number of fingers. Okay, and then obviously you really do increase your chances. So it really is, like I said, that it's a little strange to think why somebody wouldn't put out a lot of fingers. But I don't think you could put out all 10, Art. I see you're doing that. But anyway, the 21st finger is it is the name of the game. So thank you for all those who tried to help me out with it. Okay, next. By Rabbi Avin, Tchumat Hadeshem Bekama. Classic Gemara question. Tchumat Hadeshen, is there a certain shiur, an amount? We all know, right? We always talk about a requisite amount for all sorts of mitzvot. Do you need to take a certain amount of ashes off the altar in order to fulfill the mitzvah? So we're going to have an interesting structure of Gemara. You'll see in a minute. Do we learn it from, now they're going to say, okay, we have the root laharim, right? Veherim et hadeshen. The word veherim comes up in other places in the Torah. So we can assume, let's learn it from one of those. So let's try. Mitrumat maaser yafinan le, or mitrumat midyan yafinan le. Okay, what's trumat maaser? What's trumat midyan? Trumat maaser might be more familiar to you than trumat midyan. Trumat maaser is the Kohen gets, right, a portion of your produce, that's truma gdola. Then you give a tenth, right? That's 1/40th, 1/50th, or 1/60th. Then you give a tenth to the Levi. The Levi, when he gets that produce, he has to take a tenth and give it to the Kohen. And the word laharim, the root laharim is used there, right? Truma, the whole thing of truma is laharim. That's what the root of the word. So because of that, they say, maybe we learn it from there, and then it would be 1/10. Okay, that would be the shiur. You'd have to look at how much is there and take a tenth. I don't know exactly how you'd measure, but let's just assume. Next, or Trumat Midyan. What's Trumat Midyan? So if you remember, the end of Sefer Bamidbar, there's a war with the Midyanim, right? The whole story with the Midyanim and all that. Anyway, there's a war. They take the shalal from the war, and then they divide it up among the people, the booty from the war. So after they divide it up, that's what we also see about koshering and all that. After they take that, it says that they gave a meches to Hashem, 1 out of 500. So is it 1 out of 500? So now they say, so that's a big difference, first of all. Two things here I want to point out. 1/10 to 1/500 is a huge difference. Number two, it's all a portion, right? We're talking about a proportion, a proportional amount. It's not like a kizayit, certain amount. It's proportional. One, depending on how much is there, that's how much you need to take out. So the Gemara's answer is very interesting, because you would think it would either say this one or that one, but instead, it says, brings a third verse. It says it's not this, it's not that, it's something else. Tashma, let's learn it from here. Titani Rabbi Chia brings a braita that says, Ne'emal kan veherim. This, by the way, you can see what happened here. Discussion comes up in the Beit Midrash. One person, right, they suggest maybe this verse, maybe that verse. And then someone else hears the question and says, oh, I know a braita, right, that I had learned, that I had been passed down, that brings a third. And that's why it could be the answer is something totally different. It comes from a braita, and it could be whoever asked the question had no idea about this braita. Someone else answered, said, oh, I know a braita that gives the answer. And not only is it a different pasuk, but it's going to be a different type of requisite amount. It's not going to be yachasi, as we say, proportional, a fraction, 1/10, 1/500. It's not going to be like that. Ne'amar kan veherim, v'ne'amar lahalan veherim. The word veherim comes up by the deshen, and the word veherim comes up when we talk about the kmitza of a mincha. Remember, what do you do with the mincha offering? You make a dough. The Kohen takes his 3 middle fingers, he sticks them into the dough. He uses his pinky and his thumb to basically rub off whatever's on the sides, and whatever is caught in between his fingers, that's what he burns on the altar. The rest is called the shirayim, the remainder. So there it also uses the term beherim. And now we're also in the world of temple. The other two had nothing to do with the temple. So this is a perfect example, a perfect answer. So just like malahalan bekumtso, af kam bekumtso. So in the end, we learn that Trumat Hadeshen is he takes a kmitza also. He does that 3-finger thing. And with that, he goes to, and he puts it next to the altar. Now we get into the sugya that's going to take us through most of the daf, which is Amarav. Arba avodot zar chayav alehem mita. Which rituals is a non-Kohen not allowed to do? And if he does them, he's going to be obligated the death penalty. I'm going to point out now, and we'll see this later also. There's a debate about which activities, if a zar does them, he's going to get the death penalty. Now, this is the death penalty by the hands of God. So now the question is, if you say, and this is not a question the sugya is dealing with, it's a question the Mefarshim deal with, which is, if you say that for certain things, a zar, a non-Kohen, doesn't get the death penalty if he does that action, does that mean he's allowed to, like shchita, for example, can be done by a non-Kohen? Or does that mean that he's not allowed to, but it's not as severe that he won't get killed by the hands of God if he does it? Okay, there's a big difference there, right? Between saying a zar isn't chayav mita doesn't necessarily mean he's allowed to. Okay, it just means it's not so bad. So that's an important distinction that's not clear from our sugya. So Amarav, arba avodot zar chayav alehem mita. There's 4 actions you do in the temple that a non-Kohen is going to get the death penalty. Zrika, sprinkling the blood, that makes a lot of sense. That's one of the main activities. Haktara, the burning of the items on the altar. Nisuch hamayim, this was something they did just once a year, where they poured the water libations on the holiday of Sukkot, right? That's where we get Simchat Beit HaShoeva from. And nisuch hayayin, okay, and the wine libations that go with the sacrifices. Remember, there's the nisachim and the menachot that go with a lot of the offerings. So that's what we're talking about here. Those 4. A zar who does any of those things, a non-Kohen, will get the death penalty. But again, not by a court, but by the hands of God. Levi Amal, af trumat hadesha. Levi says, well, you forgot one. Also, and now we know why we're talking about this, because that's our topic, trumat hadesha. Also, this removal of the ashes, putting it next to the altar. My tamid Rav. What's his reason? Why does Rav think that this is the case? They're both going to darshan. We're going to have a bit of that ping pong of psukim. They both darshan the same verse in a different way. V'ata u'banecha itcha tishmeru et kunatchem. Okay, we're in Bamidbar chapter 18, verse 7. Ata u'banecha itcha tishmeru et kunatchem. Okay, so you and your sons, trying to Aaron, should protect the kehuna, basically, meaning only you do this. L'chol dvar hamizbeach, for anything that goes on the altar. Ulemi beit la parochet, and what's beit la parochet? Inside the parochet. What's that? The kodesh kodeshim. Notice what's missing here. There's the mizbeach, which is outside. There's the inside, the kodesh kodeshim. They don't relate. The pasuk doesn't relate to the hechal, the sanctuary, where the menorah, the shulchan, and the mizbach haktoret are. Doesn't relate to that at all. We'll get to that soon. Ve'avaditem, and you should do the avodah, the work. Avodat matana etenet kunatchem. Now, the word matana, we usually say it means gift. But where does gift come from? Why is a matana called a matana? Because it's a nitina, you're giving. So they're going to darshan this. Okay, it's not so clear what the pshat of this is. Avodah matana, it's an avodah that's a gift. Maybe it's a gift to you that I gave you to be able to do this, let's assume, but that's not the way they're going to darshan it. Vazara karev yumat. Okay, and here, this is the verse that says, anyone who's a stranger, meaning not a Kohen, is going to get the death penalty. So comes Rav and he says, avodat matana velo avodat siluk. Says avodat matana, that means an avodah that requires placing something, not removal of something. So the removal of the ashes is an action of removal. That's not mentioned in this verse. This verse is only talking about placement of things and not removal. So therefore, that's his drasha. And then he says there's another drasha. Avaditem could have just said va'avadita, I don't know. I mean, it really couldn't have, but let's just assume. The darshan, the end of that word, avaditem, is avodah. It's kind of like a merging of 2 words. Avodah tama. Tama means complete. So it has to be, we're going to see this term a bunch of times in the next few pages. Avodah tama means a complete action it has to be. V'lo avodah sheyesh achareha avodah. And not an action that is just the beginning of an action, but needs something else to finish it up. So the 2 exceptions, according to Rav, if it's an avodah of siluk, removal of something, then a zar is not going to be chayav the death penalty. Again, like I said, it's still not clear, is he allowed to do it? That we don't know. But does he get the death penalty? No. And if it's not a complete action where you still need to do something further. We're going to get into some examples of this as we go on. Okay, so now, right, one of the examples, by the way, I put this in the chart, like Kabbalah and Holacha. Notice they're missing, right? We always talk about the main avodot, shchita, which we know is actually allowed for a zar. Kabbalah and Holacha, which we generally think the Kohen has to do, but notice they're not on this list. That's accepting the blood and walking it to the altar. That's because both of them are not a complete activity. If you don't do them, right? If you do them, you haven't finished anything yet. You have to do the zrika. That's the end. That's the final activity there. So therefore, those aren't right. Those would be exceptions here that you wouldn't be obligated the death penalty. What about Levi? Levi, Rabbi Rachmana l'chol dvar hamizbech. Levi theoretically agrees with Rav. Okay, certainly about avodat tamah. He agrees with Rav. We're going to see that later. But he says, theoretically, you're right about the siluk, except that it says in the pasuk l'chol dvar mizbech. So while it's true that maybe other activities of siluk you won't be obligated the death penalty, but if it has to do with taking something off the altar, it has to do with the mizbech. The pasuk said for anything that goes on the mizbech, that must be to include even the truma kadeshin. So that's the root of their machlok. So now we're going to have to do, obviously, what does Rav do with chol tamar mizbech? The Rav hahula tuye sheva hazaot shebifnim v'sheba mitzorah. The chol avodat mizbech comes to tell you that, by the way, there's a few things you do in the heichal. Remember, we said we didn't mention the heichal. So he says the chol tamar mizbech comes to say anything that has to do with the altar, like the ones that we sprinkle on the inside. If you remember, there's 5 sacrifices that instead of doing the blood on the outer altar, you go inside, like on Yom Kippur and the Paril and Davar Shel Tzibur. There's a few where you do the sprinkling of the blood on the inside altar, on that small Mizbeach HaKtoret, right? It's much smaller, teeny, compared to the huge Mizbeach that we've been talking about, all the size and how large it was, right? That was very large. This one is a very small altar that is on the inside of the Hechal. So he says the Chol Dvar Mizbeach comes to include that. So Levi, now we have a problem. What's Levi how is he gonna learn all those other things? Nafkalemi davar v'chol davar. He says, oh, well, the phrase v'chol davar has 2 elements. One is davar, which comes to include something additional. That must be all the stuff on the inside. V'chol comes to include the trumat adeshin, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter. The point is we can do 2 drashot because it says v'chol davar and not just v'davar on mizbech. So then Rav, what does he do? Because he then should learn both, and he doesn't. The Rav, this is usually the way the ping pong ends. Davar chol davar lo davish. I'm not part of the game because I don't do anything with that kind of drasha. I don't think, right? There's no way to have said the verse other than saying v'chol davar, and therefore I think it includes one thing, and you don't darshan it to include 2 different things. Now, avodat matana. Now they suggest the following. Wait a minute. This pasuk really sounds like a classic example of a klal uprat. Remember what that is? First, we have something general, and then we have something very specific, and we'll see what the rules are when you have a klal and then a prat. So remember the verse. The verse says, we'll read it inside again. It's on the sheet also if you have it in front of you. Okay, here it comes. That sounds very general. Then it says, and right inside the Kodesh Kodeshim, now they say like this. Skip a few words, right? And all that. Then it says avodat matana. That's a prat. That's a detail. Klalu prat. When you have a klalu prat, what are the rules? Ein bechlal elamasha beprat. When you take this general rule and then you say something very specific, we only include things that are like that specific item. So therefore, you would say, oh, this only includes pu'ulat matana and not pu'ulat siluk, right? Avodat matana in, avodat siluk lo. So that's a question on Levi. Levi, why don't you read this as a klal prat, and then you'll get to the conclusion that Rav got. So he says, no. Amakra umi beit laparochet va'avadetem. Levi says, look, you forgot that there's a few words in between there, which are referring to what? The pasuk moves from general, not the klal general, but outside the altar, right? The outside altar to dvar mizbeach, that's the mizbeach, the outer altar, to the kodesh kodeshim, and then it says avodat matana. So in between the klal, which is referring to the outer mizbeach, it switches topics to talk about the kodesh kodeshim. So he says, al mibeit la parochet hu avodat matana v'lo avodat siluk. Habachutz afilu avodat siluk. So he says, well, I agree with you that there's a klalu prat. However, I think that when the prat limits it, it's limiting, yes, I agree with you, that only pulat matana, not pulat siluk. We're now finding that he actually does agree with it. But he says, since it appears right after the words that refer to the Kodesh Kodashim, it's only in the Kodesh Kodashim that is Zar, who takes out items from inside the Kodesh Kodashim and removes something, is not going to be obligated to death penalty. However, if it's on the outer Mizbeach, he will be. Now, you might say this sounds counterintuitive, right? A Zar who does something in the Kodesh Kodashim is much worse. Now, first of all, it is, because not allowed to go into Kodesh Kodashim. So he's got a separate problem, but it's not the problem of this. This problem of removal does not apply in the Kodesh Kodashim. And maybe you'd say also the death penalty is to prevent you from doing things. Now, he's already unlikely that he's going to do something in the Kodesh Kodashim because he's not even allowed in the Hechal, if you remember. So of course he's not allowed in the Kodesh Kodashim, and it's unlikely he'd ever be there. So therefore, you don't need to institute the death penalty in a case that's so unlikely. Maybe that's one way to understand it. But the main point, so first of all, what is an avodat siluk in the Kodesh Kodashim, right? There's no ashes or anything else to remove. But what do you have to remove? If you remember, the Kohen Gadol comes in there with a spoon, right? This kaf, it's like not exactly the same spoon that we would think of a spoon, but this spoon, and a pan where he has the coals burning to burn the incense. So those have to be removed from the Kodesh Kodashim. That's what we're talking about. If the Zar removed them, he wouldn't be obligated to death penalty. Okay, because the exclusion of the matana, nitina, and not siluk is only for the Kodesh Kodashim because of it's where it's placed in the verse. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. If you want to say that they all only apply to the Kodesh Kodashim because they're mentioned with the Kodesh Kodashim and not in the beginning part of the verse, so you could say the same thing with the second category. Va'avadetam nami, omi beit laparach etud avodat tama velo avodah sheyesh acharei avodah. Habachutz, afilu avodah sheyesh acharei avodah. Then you're going to say the same thing with this avodat tama. Then are you going to say that if there's an activity that's done in the Kodesh Kodashim that is a nitina, it's a giving activity, not a removal, but it's not a complete action, which remember, Levi agreed with that concept, that it has to be a complete action. And let's say it's in the Kodesh Kodashim, right? Maybe only in the Kodesh Kodashim, that's a criteria, but not bachutz. Maybe outside, it doesn't have to be an avodat taman. That's clearly ridiculous. That's not what we say. So, because the word avodatem appears also right after the mi beit laparochet. So if your klalu prat is going to be only for the Kodesh Kodashim, then wouldn't you say the same thing with the avodat taman? To which he answers, ve'avadetam. Notice it starts with the word vav. Vav is always connects it to something before. Hadar arvekra. The pasuk connects the avodatem to the beginning part of the verse. And that's why the avodat tamah is relevant across the board. But the klalu prat, where the prat appears after, is only relevant to the Kodesh Kodashim. Okay, where again, we're going to say only pulat siluk, even Levi will agree about that. By Rava. Now Rava is going to ask two questions on Levi. Avodats, we're actually going to have three questions altogether, but the third one's going to be on Rav and Levi, and it's going to be the same style of question. It's going to be one question that leads to many other questions. Now, notice the list that they had. So they had this list, either 4 or 5 things, and notice what's not on the list. Like I said, nothing in the Hechal is on the list, right? The menorah, the shulchan, anything related to that. So, by Rav, Avodat siluk behechal mahu. Actually, I said it wrong in terms of the structure. Let me clarify. Rava asks the question, he answers the question, and then we're going to have questions on his answer. That's the structure, my mistake. Avodat siluk behechal mahu. Lifnim medamin alei or lachutz medamin alei. Now we're going to go back to this question about the Hechal. We mentioned the Hechal is not mentioned in the verse. So and now we came up with this categorization according to Levi, that if you're going to have that inside, you're going to have in the Kodesh Kodashim, the Zar, a non-Kohen, takes something out like the spoon or something, not going to be obligated. But if he does a Pulat Siluk like the Haramat Hadeshin on the outer altar, he's going to be obligated the death penalty. So now let's take the Hechal, which is in between. Where does it go? Do we say it's like the outer section, or is it like the inner section? So Hadar Pashta, he now answers his question. Mi beit ulimi beit. Notice the word says ulimi beit haparochet. Now, mi beit laparochet means inside the inner area, the Kodesh Kodeshim. But ulimi beit, why do you need the vav and the lamed in the beginning of that? They say that must be including the hechal is like the Kodesh Kodeshim, in which case you're not going to be obligated the death penalty if a zar goes into the hechal and does some act, or actually I shouldn't say goes into the hechal. You can't go into the hechal. It's not allowed. But let's say he does an action that's normally done in the hechal. Let's assume he does it outside the hechal. Again, this shouldn't happen because you normally don't take it out, but I'm going to show you a really interesting Rambam soon. So hold off on that. So now, actually, let's go back to the structure. The structure is because I said a little bit not clearly before. I want to clarify. Rava asked this question. He answers it on this answer, which all has to do with Levi, because Levi was the one who made that distinction, Kodesh Kodeshim and outside, which Rav didn't make that distinction because Rav thinks Pulat Siluk is never obligated. So now what's the story with the Hechal? So it seems like, according to what Rav just said, Rava just said, the Hechal is treated like the Kodesh Kodeshim. Anything you remove, you won't be obligated for. Okay, so if you do an action of removal in something related to the Hechal, right, something in the Hechal, you won't be obligated the death penalty. So now they say, well, then that doesn't fit with your list of your 4 things. Notice what wasn't on the list of things that you're obligated death penalty, or the 5 according to Levi. Alameata, zar shesideret hashulchan lichayev. According to this, if a zar sets up the table, right? Remember, pu'ulat siluk, you're not obligated for, but pu'ulat matana, you'll be obligated in the hechal. So why didn't it mention in the list? If a zar sets up the bread on the table in the hechal, he should be chayav, and it doesn't list that on the list, so he's obviously not. So what do they answer? Ika sidor bezichim. No, that's one of the exclusions, because remember, what did Rav say? It has to be an avodat taman. Even Levi agreed with that. It has to be complete. Putting the bread is not complete until you bring the 2 bowls with the frankincense. So they say, okay, well then, let's go to the next one. So sidor bezichim lichayev. Then the next stage, we're going to do the same structure with the second question, which is going to be about the menorah. We're going to take one eye and say, that's not the last. Well, what about the next activity? That would be the last. Sidor bezichim lichayev. So they say, Ika siluk v'aktara. No, it's still not. When you put those 2 bowls of frankincense, your job is not finished until the upcoming week, a week later, when you remove them and you burn them on the altar. That's when it's finished. So therefore, and that obviously will not be obligated because that's siluk, that's removal. There we already said it's not obligated. Now we understand why. Next, zar. So same structure of question. Zar shesideret hamenorah lichayev. So again, if he sets up the menorah, he should be obligated because it's a pu'ulat matana. It's in the hechal, and according to what you're saying, siluk in the hechal you're not obligated, but putting on in the hechal you would be obligated. So the answer, ikanit, and notice it's not on the list. So ikanitinat ptila. Again, we're going to say it's not the final action. Setting up the candles is, you still need the wicks. Natam ptila lichayev. Okay, so let's say when you put the wicks, you should be obligated, right? At some point, it's going to be the final activity. So say, no, that's still not the final activity. Ikanitinat shemen. You have to put the oil in. So they say, okay, fine. So natan shemen lichayev. At least when you put the oil in, that should be the final activity. So what do you mean? Ika adlaka. You have to light the candles. Now, we've clearly at this point gotten to the final activity. So what are they going to say about that? And it doesn't say if a zar lights the menorah, he's going to be obligated. It wasn't listed there. And it's not one of the exceptions. So what's going on? Hidlik lichayev. So this, sorry, that was the question. Hidlik lichayev. So they say, hadlaka lav avodahi. Interesting answer. Lighting the candles is not an avodah. This is very interesting. What do you mean it's not an avodah? Seems like one of the avodotas to light the candles. So people explain the following. When you light a candle, what happens? You don't, first of all, it's not really work. Like think about slaughtering an animal. That's work, right? You might say, right, even accepting the blood, you have to kind of accept the blood, but lighting a candle, it's not really much of an activity. Maybe you could say the same thing about accepting the blood, but it's not really an activity. And really what they say is that the candle light, like you light it and then it kind of lights up on its own. Okay. Or some people say it's eimbo mamash. There's no real, it's not something tangible really, a flame. So whatever reason, they feel like this is not, they consider this not an avodah, it's not like something real. So therefore, that's why the Zar is not obligated. Mavet, death. So now the Gemara says below, wait, he's not. Vahatanya, doesn't it say, V'natnu b'nei Aaron? You're going to say, lighting a fire is not considered avodah. I'm going to show you a case where lighting a fire is clearly considered avodah, and it has to be done by a kohen. V'natnu b'nei Aaron kohen, esh ala mizbeach baruchu etzim ala esh. The b'nei Aaron came and they put a fire. They're supposed to put a fire on the altar, and they're supposed to arrange the wood, the logs on the fire. Limed al so the Braita says about this, and this is going to create a problem. Limed al hatzatat elita shelo tehei ela b'kohen kasher u'b'klei sharei. They learn from this verse, has to be done by a kohen and it has to be done with holy vessels, which means that burning this fire, which is like lighting a candle, it's the same activity, same action. So that's right. That's here you see lighting a fire is an action. So they say no. Hatzatat elita avodahi hadlaka lav avodahi. Very simply, they just say, no, it's not the same. So again, the Mepharshim say, what's not the same? It depends really what you thought about hadlaka to begin with. Maybe you say that this has mamash. A fire has logs, wood, right? It's something is actually burning. Whereas in a candle, it's just the oil that's not really so much of anything. Or if you've ever made a bonfire, you know, right? Coming off of Lag BaOmer, you know that it's a lot of work to build a bonfire. So if you say, you know, lighting a candle is a nothing, you can't really call that an avodah. But lighting a fire on the altar is actually work, okay, right? Some people are better at it than others. I've been to cases where, right, people have trouble building a fire. So that's another possible answer. Okay. Before we move on, I want to read the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchot Bi'at HaMikdash, okay, which goes, you know, going into the temple. Perek Tet Halacha Zayin says the following. V'chein hadlakat hanerot kshera b'zarim. He says from our sugi you can learn that a non-Kohen is allowed to. This is where I said before. It's not clear, is he not allowed to? He just doesn't get the death penalty? Or is he allowed to? And the Rambam goes so far as to say, which is crazy, because it says in the Torah, right? And this is a good question, right? The Kohen's supposed to light the candles. So some people say when it says in the Torah, the Kohen's supposed to light the candles, it means lehitiv hanero, what we talked about before, which is fixing the candles, cleaning them out, but not actually to light them. And that a non-Kohen actually is kasher according to the Rambam. People jump at the Rambam for saying this, but the Rambam actually says a non-Kohen can light the candles. This is fascinating. Now, obviously, you have the problem. How can you get into the Heichal, where the menorah is? So hold off. So the Rambam says, right, lefichach imitiv hakohen et hanerot. If the Kohen prepared them, which that for sure a Kohen has to do, v'hotzian lachutz, and he takes the menorah out of the Heichal. Could you imagine such a thing? Right? He takes the menorah out of the Heichal. Mutar lezar ladlikot. So maybe the Rambam is trying to say this is unlikely, but he says theoretically, one could light the candle as long as, right, what he's doing is he's separating the two issues. There's an issue that he can't go into the sanctuary, but if he were to go out, he'd be able to light the candles. So it's very interesting. I see Shoshana, you're suggesting, very interesting suggestion that maybe he's trying out those extra candles that were set up by Shlomo and not the main candelabra. Possibly. It's an interesting suggestion that you're suggesting. I didn't look into it. But anyway, that's a very interesting Rambam. Now we have, so those were two questions on Rava's answer, basically saying the Heichal is like the inside, right? But then basically also saying that things done in the Heichal, if it's nitina, then they would be obligated. And yet we see they're not. So they resolve it by saying each time it's not an avodat tamah, right? It's not complete, or, right? And then when it finally is complete, it's a removal, or it's not complete. And when you finally get to the end, it's actually not a ritual. Next, now we have a question on both Rav and Levi. What if the Zar puts the logs on the altar? Sounds like what you're saying. It's outside. It's a piulat netina. You should be obligated. No, it's missing. It's not an avodat tamah. You put first, remember Shti and Erev, you put them crisscross on top of each other. And then on top of that, the Kohen brings 2 logs in the morning and 2 logs in the afternoon. So it's not a complete activity, to which obviously we're now going to ask, so Sider Shni Gzirei Etzim. It's the same type of questioning as before. Lichayev. So if you bring the 2 logs and it's a Zar doing it, then you should be obligated. And again, it doesn't say that in the list. So if it doesn't say it in the list, you must not be obligated. So they say, Ika Sidor Evarim. It's also not a complete action because you're only putting the logs there to make a fire to then burn the parts of the animal. So it's putting the parts that are the main part. But now they ask a question on this. They say, wait a minute, and we're going to darshan, and we're going to see this line in a few more dapim, more in detail. He actually thinks that you are obligated in this case, a zar who does this. So they say, beha pligi. That's a machloka between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav and Levi. Rav and Levi think it's not an avodat hamas, you're not obligated, right? So mar savar avodat hamahi, umar savar lav avodat hamahi. It's a matter of your perspective. When you put the two logs, is that the final? Because you've now finished the action of building the fire, right? Or having everything prepared to make the fire. Or is it really just a preparatory activity for putting on the parts of the animal? So therefore, we have this two ways of looking at it. This is, the avodat hamah is a little bit complicated. When is anything ever finished until you, right? There's always another activity, another activity, another activity. So do we view this as you've completed the building of the wood? Or do we say, no, the building of the wood is only to do the next activity, and therefore it's not an avodat hamah? And that's why Rav and Levi think that it's an avodat hamah and they don't list it. And I'm sorry, think it's not an avodat hamah and they don't list it because it's not a complete activity. And Rabbi Yochanan actually thinks that the zar is obligated, the death penalty for it. Now we have a Tanya Kavatei de Rav, Tanya Kavatei de Levi, a Braita to support each reading. Tanya Kavatei de Rav. So the Braita that supports Rav, it's going to be very simple, this part. Avodot shezar chayav alehem mita. Here we go. Zrikat dam, bein lifnim, whether inside or outside. Hamazeh b'chatat ha'of, hamimatzeh v'maktir bo'olat ha'of, sprinkling the blood in the chatat ha'of, or there's this activity where you kind of smear the blood. You squeeze the blood out of the bird. A little unpleasant. We'll get there when we get to zvachim. V'hamenasech shlosha lugim mayim u'shlosha lugim yayin, and the nisuch hamayim and the nisuch hayayin that we talked about, the libations. So that supports Rav. It doesn't say trumat hadeshen. But Tanya Kavatei de Levi, avodot shezar chayav alehem mita, hamirim et hadeshen, there you have it. Lifting removing the ashes, that's listed here. The sheva hazaot shebifnim b'sheva mitzorah, and the 7 sprinklings that you do inside and the mitzorah, the sprinklings they do, if there's oil, they sprinkle on in the case of the mitzorah. And if you put anything on the altar, that's right, putting anything on the altar, whether it's good to go on the altar or whether it's even something that's disqualified to go on the altar. Now you might say, why putting something disqualified on the altar would mean you did an activity, right? It's not, you did something wrong. So they explain, if you remember, we've distinguished before between something you put on the altar that really doesn't belong there and has to be removed, or something you put on the altar that's disqualified, but if it's already on the altar, we let it stay on the altar. It's called the im Allah lo yered. If it already went on, then we leave it on. It must be referring to the second category there of things that are allowed to go on the altar, just you're not really, shouldn't have put it there, but once it's there, we leave it on. And that's the kind that a zar will be obligated for. So the main point there was that it said, Trumat Hadeshen, a zar is obligated the death penalty for. Now we're going to end with this pious. Lama mifaisim. Why do we do this whole lottery system? So the Gemara asks, what do you mean? Lama mifaisim kedamaran. We already explained why. We talked about death. We talked about, right? We talked about all this competition and how there's such a strong desire to do things that obviously that's why. So they say, okay, that obviously wasn't the question. Why are there, we're going to see 4 lotteries done a day? Why don't you just do one and cover everything all at once? So Amar Yochanan, kedei lahargish kol azara, to have action, noise in the temple. We want hustle bustle. It's very interesting, and I want you to think about this a little bit. Shneimar asher yachtav namtik sod bebeit Elohim nelech beragesh. We took counsel together, and in the house of God, we walked with excitement. This idea, now it's interesting. I want you to envision 2 different types of temples. One, you would think a very quiet, solemn temple atmosphere, nothing really going on. And our temple is not that at all, right? Our temple is hustle bustle, lots of action, and they want lots of people there. I see the animals didn't make hustle bustle enough. It's a good question, right? But we want people action. We want excitement of the people being in the temple. We want noise. We want things going on. We don't want it to be this quiet temple. It actually reminds me of this Ketz HaMizbech, that you always want activity going on. So, all that extra money, remember in Shkalim, it all went to putting sacrifices on the altar all the time. So it was always action. We don't want this quiet type temple. And I'm sure there are temples that are more the other type. And I just thought it was interesting to think about. So yeah, also, I like your comment over like a Jewish home, right? Always lively, always things going on. Okay, last part for today. We're going to start this machloket. Bamet mifaisim. with what? Meaning, what are the Kohanim wearing when they do the payas, when they do the lottery? Are they wearing their big day kodesh or are they wearing their big day chol? And again, we're going to get into psychology here. Okay, so here we go. Rav Nachman Amar b'big day chol. He says they wear regular clothes, not the Kohen clothing. Rav Sheshet Amar big day kodesh. You wear the Kohen clothing. Rav Nachman Amar b'big day chol. Why? Amar b'big day kodesh. If they're all wearing big day kodesh, okay, they're wearing sanctified clothes. What might happen? You might lose the lottery, but you're a bully and you're strong and you're fast and you're going to go run and do that action anyway. You don't care that you lost the pies. You're just going to do it anyway. And if you're already in your clothes, it'll take you 2 seconds. You walk over there and just do it. And then, right, that we clearly don't want that going on. So therefore, you wear your big day chol, so you can't just rush into doing something out of, passion, trying to, again, get rid of this passion of these people that, they might do something not expected. Rav Sheshet Amar, it's actually kind of coming from the same reason, b'big day kodesh. You wear the sanctified clothes. Why? If you say the big day chol, then what will if you say the big day kodesh, what might happen? I'm sorry, the big day chol, you might get so excited that you won the lottery and you really want to go do that action right now. You'll run and you'll do it, and you'll forget that you're not wearing the clothing. Then you'll just ruin it. So therefore, be ready in action because there's so much excitement that you might just go and do it and forget what you were, what was going on. So interesting. Each one has their approach. Tomorrow, we're going to see where they get it from. We'll start from this Mina Aminala because it really continues through tomorrow. We'll start with there tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.